Well, here we are. What day is it? I've, I thought it was just myself getting older, but I found out that many people are having a hard time keeping track of time, when especially we have so much of it. But it is that the normal anchors of our days, you know, going to work, going to school, coming back, going out on the weekend, all of this has collapsed. In 1951, there was a movie with Michael Rennie and Patricia Neal. Not that that's important, but the title of it was The Day the Earth Stood Still. Science fiction fans would remember it well. And it occurred to me that just as in that movie in 1951, when in order to demonstrate that he was an alien and come out, even though he came out of the flying saucer, but Michael Rennie had to demonstrate his power. And what he did is he erased all the power grids on the face of the earth. Nothing ran. Cars stopped, trolleys stopped, trains stopped. The only thing he left running were hospitals and important things that needed to continue. Remind you of anything? And so the thoughts that I have today have to do with how do we use our time? What is it that happens when we are still? Are we only yearning to be able to go on vacation, get to the beach, play golf, get back to work? What is it that you and I can take from this time when the earth stands still? Here is an article from the New York Times which says, "What day is it? No rhythm and deepening blues." It took a while for me to figure that out, and there was a play on rhythm and blues. There's no rhythm and deepening blues. He says this is from Alan Lewis. He says, "In this free-form kind of weird world that we're in right now, everybody's internal clock is thrown. Among the stranger consequences of the coronavirus pandemic is how, by unmooring the daily lives of tens of millions of people, it has made time itself feel distorted. Psychologists say the sensation is a result of losing social anchors, chronic stress and anxiety, and drastic changes to normal routines." Tom Hanks, while he was hosting Saturday Night Live, said, he summed up what it feels like to be stuck at home and to watch through windows, TV, and the internet as the world changes at a bewildering pace. He says, "There's no such thing as Saturdays anymore. It's just every day is today." We're kind of stuck in another movie, Groundhog Day. And that did not end until, you know, the protagonists learned how to relate to others. The article in the New York Times says some psychologists have compared the coronavirus's effects to the aftermath of a natural disaster, except the disaster is moving in slow motion, taking place everywhere, and seemingly no end in sight. Dr. Mary McNaughton Castle, a professor of psychology in Texas, said what makes COVID so weird is that the physical environment looks very normal, but we have lost every single social anchor that we would normally use, except for Mass. Through streaming, we're able to do this. She says, for those able to work from home, daily cues like commuting and socializing after work have evaporated. Work days blur together, and weekends are just weekdays with fewer obligations. Dr. McNaughton said people's perception of time was always relative and generally depended on the anchors of work and personal life. Time seems to go by more quickly when you're busy or with friends, but it crawls by when you're bored or sick in bed. Students might say while you're in school. You probably don't have as many things to do to fill the time, so the perception is that time is going slower. It's a sense of being adrift. For those still going to work every day as a journey into a dangerous and uncertain world, with new rules about masks, washing hands, staying away from others. For those who have lost work, there are intense new stresses about income, health insurance, and the future. Dr. Elissa Appel, a professor of psychiatry at the University of California, says we have a perfect storm for being cognitively taxed. It's all changing so fast, our body is just on vigilance mode. Living in a pandemic can be compared to the uncertainty of starting a new job, in the sense that everything is new, you're making a lot of new decisions, and it's tiring. And that disruption in your habits and having to learn new ones is draining. Everything takes much more effort, even though we have so much time on our hands. Remember when you always wished for more time? If only I had time. If I had time. One day when I get a chance, I will. So what are we doing with this time that we have when we are so still? Psalm 46, be still and know that I am God. This verse comes from a longer section of Scripture that proclaims the power and the security of God, our refuge and our strength. When we are still and surrender to God, we can find peace even when the earth gives way, even when the mountains fall, or the nations go into an uproar and kingdoms fall. Verse 2 and verse 6 of the 46th Psalm, be still and know that I am God. When life gets overwhelming and busyness takes precedence in a time of struggle or in a time of being unable to get to work, to be involved in life as we knew it, remember Psalm 46, verse 1. God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Our second reading talked about how our faith, in times of trial would be tested. God is our refuge and strength. So place your hands in the hands of God. Run to him during this time. Acknowledge that he is God and that he is exalted in the earth. Be still and know that when all things change, we still have God, who always was, who always will be, and his Son, Jesus Christ, yesterday, today, and tomorrow the same. What can we take from this extra time now that God has caught our attention as the earth stood still? In the scripture, we see the apostles are locked in a room because of fear, and Christ breaks through that door without ever breaking it down. He simply passes through it and arrives and says to them, peace be with you. And that peace, that shalom, is an entirely different meaning than what we tend to associate with peace, the word peace. We tend to think of peace as free from conflict, free from war, free from struggle. We're living a peaceful existence. But the word shalom has to do with a sense of well-being that is rooted in God and overrides everything else that is happening in the world. It is not so much a sense of being free from conflict as a sense of resting secure in God, of a sense of the wholeness and the holiness that we may have when we remember who we are, who made us, and how we are constantly sustained by the love of God. Someone once said, if God even stopped thinking of us for a moment, we and everything else would vanish in an instant. So here is this quote from a little article by Thomas Halleck, a professor of sociology at Charles University in Prague. This is from America magazine. He says, "Christ has passed through the door that we had locked out of fear of others. Christ has passed through the wall with which we surrounded ourselves. He has opened up a space whose breadth and depth has made us dizzy." This isolation, this separateness that we have is remarkable, but it can remind you and me of the different bubbles that we have lived in until very recently, of the separate lives that we have made for ourselves, of the separate space we have carved out in a world of almost 9 billion people. We come and go, things are at our hand. We make of ourselves a life that we want to the extent that we can make it. Now all of that has been surrendered. And so what is left is a knowledge that that isolation that we so carefully crafted and enjoyed is something very, very ephemeral, like a little soap bubble that can be burst just with a breath of air. We are a people of God. We are our sisters and brothers. We are united as human souls on the face of this spinning world. In remarking about the early church, it says, on the very threshold of its history, the early church of Jews and pagans experienced the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, in which Jesus prayed and taught. The Jewish people of those days found a courageous and creative solution when there no longer was a place of worship. They replaced the altar of the demolished temple with the Jewish family table, and the practice of sacrifice they replaced with the practice of private and communal prayer. They replaced burnt offerings and blood sacrifices with reflection, praise, and study of Scripture. Around the same time, early Christians banished from the synagogue sought a new identity of their own. On the ruins of traditions, Jews and Christians learned anew to read the law and the prophets and interpret them afresh. And Professor Halleck says, are we not in a similar situation in our days? He goes on to write that when Rome fell on the threshold of the 5th century, there were instant explanations from many quarters. The pagans saw it as punishment of the gods for the adoption of Christianity, while many Christians saw it as God's punishment on Rome. St. Augustine rejected both of those interpretations. At that watershed moment, he developed his theology of the age-old battle between two opposing cities, not of Christians and pagans, but of two loves dwelling in the human heart. The love of self, closed to transcendence, amor sui usque ad contemptum Dei, and the love that gives of itself and thereby finds God, amor Dei usque ad contemptum sui. Our time of civilizational change calls for a new understanding of who we can be when we may seek after contemplation and reflection with the time that we have to try to discover what city do we live in. Do we live in a city of the love of self, or do we live in a city of the love that gives of itself and thereby finds God? That little sign, thank God for the helpers that we put on our intersection between Trumpeter and Twin Rivers, is really a reminder for us to remember who other people are that are giving of themselves. And if our eyes are open and our minds are clear, we should say, That's the kind of person I want to be with the time that I have left, uncertain as it is. We can, of course, accept this Lent of empty and silent churches as little more than a brief temporary measure soon to be forgotten. Thomas Halleck continues, we can also embrace it as an opportune moment to seek a new identity for Christianity in a world that is being radically transformed before our eyes. The current pandemic is certainly not the only global threat facing our world now and in the future. And so he says this: let us embrace the approaching Eastertide, the 50 days between Easter and Pentecost, as a challenge to seek God again. Let us not seek the living among the dead. Let us seek him boldly and tenaciously, and let us not be taken aback if he appears to us as a foreigner. We will recognize Christ, whatever his nationality, by his wounds, by his voice when he speaks to us intimately, by the Spirit that brings peace and banishes fear. With so many people dying, it may seem like something far removed from us unless it touches our family or our dear ones. But John Donne wrote this: no man is an island, entire of itself. Every man, woman is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as any manner of thy friends or of thine own were. Any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. God, give us the grace to use this time well and to emerge from it with a much larger association than perhaps what we have imagined as being beneficial in the past. Be still and know that I am God.